Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room.
Okay, members, we are quorate, and I think that we are okay. We don't have any serious issues with the star leaf. You can mute your microphones until you need to speak, because that keeps background noise down. And fire me a message into the WhatsApp facility here if you want to ask questions. And you know the usual will be broadcast throughout Parliament buildings and online, and you use your devices so long as they're muted. The only apologies I have noted this morning is from Philip, and if there's any voting take place, he has delegated his vote to myself. Members, Chairperson's business number 2. As we approach Christmas, it's standard practice for the committees to delegate authority to the Chairperson and Deputy Chairperson to consider any contentious FOI requests that are received. Members will recall that we have agreed to this previously, and that the committee will be notified of any requests and issued responses at its first meeting after recess. Are we okay with this practice? And if you're content, that should any urgent committee correspondence come in over Christmas, is forwarded to members via email, and that Nick issues a text message into the WhatsApp group. Okay, members. Item number 3, draft minutes of the 9th of December, page 7. Can I get agreement till sign these? Okay, members, matters rising. Draft budget 22 to 25. This is page 17. Final version of the draft budget. This is the first multi-year budget to be agreed in principle by the Executive for some time, and the key points in relation to DAERA's funding include approximately 540 million in baseline funding, rising by about 2% in the next 2 financial years, and a further increase of 1% in 24 to 25, and a capital budget of 327 million over the next 3 years. Members are agreeable that we invite the Department to give an oral briefing on the plans for the 3-year budget, and in particular its plan for the green growth strategy funding. Yeah, that'll be New Year. Can we also write to members? Okay, if we also write to the Department of Finance to ascertain what mechanisms will be put in place to scrutinise the deployment of the budget over the next 3 years and the role of the Fiscal Council. Okay. Okay, members. The item 5 is a written briefing consultation on the draft NI Food Strategy Framework. Post consultation. It's 115 of your papers. It's a written briefing from the Department following the consultation of the draft Food Strategy Framework. Consultation closed 19th November, and a high-level summary of the results can be found at page 117. The framework has 6 strategic priorities, and DAERA will lead a cross-departmental food programme board under the auspices of the Green Growth Strategy to take forward 5-year action plans to deliver the strategy. The key points in the consultation are that the vast majority of respondents were in favour of a whole government approach to food strategy, supported the 6 priority areas, and agreed with the high-level vision of the framework. Issues raised by stakeholders included how the strategy would actually be planned and implemented in practice, and how the Department would ensure adequate stakeholder engagement on specific policies going brought forward. The committee has been invited to make any comments on the strategic framework before it is finalised. Are we okay to note the briefing, members? And if you have any comments you want to raise on or anything like that, that's okay. Okay. Members, we have a written briefing from DAERA on the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Order Amendments 2020, which has been led by DAERA. It's at page 136 of your packs, the written briefing on the amendments to the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Scheme. DAERA will be bringing forward 2 statutory rules that will come into effect in February and April 2022, respectively, that will make technical amendments to aspects of the emissions trading scheme and strengthen provision around enforcement of the scheme rules. There will not be any substantive policy changes. Are we okay to note the briefing, members? If you have any comments, you can fire them on to Nick. Okay, members. Sorry, John, you looking in there? No, sorry. I thought you were. Okay, members. Item number 7 is the Agriculture Wages Board. You'll be aware the committee sought views on trade from the trade unions on proposal to dissolve the Agriculture Wages Board earlier this year in order to inform our considerations. Page 140 of the packs, the clerk has provided a summary of the trade unions' responses, which are also available in full alongside the Department's consultation outcome report. Nick, do you want to speak to the paper?
Chair, thank you. Yes, indeed. So this is by way of follow-up to our committee meeting on the 21st of October when we considered a written briefing from the Department following its consultation on proposals to potentially abolish the Agricultural Wages Board. And at the time, members requested that we liaise with the trade unions who had responded to the department's consultation in order to get more detail on their views. So, as Chair said, the full replies from both Unite the Union and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions are included in the pack, but the key points arising from those replies are as follows. So, Unite considers that the AWB plays a vital role in enhancing terms and conditions for agricultural workers, including improved basic pay rate, sick pay, overtime and other holiday entitlements. It is concerned that if the AWB was wound up, there would be an erosion of these protections, leading to poorer working conditions, particularly for young, male and migrant workers. In the absence of these protections, Unite is concerned that there would be a potential race to the bottom in terms of providing the minimum level of pay and conditions for workers. And then there's an associated concern that without those enhanced protections, new workers may be discouraged from entering the sector, which might compound the labour shortages resultant from Brexit, which obviously have been reported in the media over the past number of months. Unite also make the argument that agricultural workers require enhanced levels of protection, given the inherent seasonality and unpredictability of the work in the sector. So that's they consider that why there's a need for enhanced overtime pay rates and also good comparative sick pay in what is a comparatively very high-risk industry. The specific characteristics of the agricultural sector, in Unite's view, necessitate an effective forum for collective bargaining, and that is currently facilitated through the AWB. There's also a concern that the abolition of the AWB would potentially breach the International Labour Organisation's Convention to maintain collective bargaining, and could potentially erode safeguarding against trafficking and exploitation in the sector. And I suppose at a more strategic level, there's a concern that there could be an adverse knock-on effect to rural economy associated with potential reduction in wages and economic output. The Irish Congress of Trade Unions broadly supports Unite's submission and position on the matter, and further advised the committee that it considers that the AWB provides an effective forum for collective bargaining for low-paid workers in the sector, and if it was wound up, there's the potential for deterioration in industrial relations, and also a further concern that the terms and conditions of workers could be eroded, and that it may lead to employers competing on the price of labour. And there's the Irish Congress of Trade Unions also was concerned that if the AWB was wound up, it could exacerbate the already disproportionately high number of low-paid workers locally. And it also makes the point that the proposal to dissolve AWB, in their view, contravenes the New Decade, New Approach commitment to promote workers' rights. And that's really, in a nutshell, a summary of the two responses that we received from the trade unions. And as I say, the full details are in the pack, Chair. So, thank you.
Thank you for that, Mick. New members?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, William.
I think there's a lot of halloo in that in relation to that. I think we have a minimum wage now which does protect workers much more than the Agricultural Wages Board ever done. Up till the minimum wage was set and increased this last number of years. The Agricultural Wages Board didn't do very much for workers in my eyes, because we now have a situation where minimum wage is rising every year. I think it'll be about £10 an hour shortly, and I think the setting of the minimum wage has done much more to protect workers and low-paid workers than anything that ever the Agricultural Wages Board has ever done.
Thanks for that comment, William. Okay, well, members, can I? Yeah, Rosemary, go ahead.
Yeah. Come in just for a moment, sorry. Yeah, I would tend to agree with what William has said, and I'm also a bit concerned. You know, we had, especially at the beginning when migrants came over here to perhaps work, you know, they had quite bad conditions, and yet what did the Agriculture Wages Board do for them in relation to their housing, etc., etc.? There didn't seem to be much support there. So I would be concerned how much actual help they help these migrants, how much actual support they give these migrants.
Well, can members, obviously, the union have presented some very strong views. They obviously make the case that, like, migrant workers, for example, are particularly vulnerable, and this AWB is a very useful sort of collective bargaining mechanism to support them. Could members agree that we forward this to the union's views to the department for comment? Would that be okay? Okay. Members okay with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, members, I'm going to move on here now to item 8. It's the draft rural policy framework, and it's page 169 in your packs, a written briefing from the department on its consultation on the rural policy framework that closed on the 6th of September. There were 105 responses, and the key things was that the vast majority of respondents were supportive of the framework's vision, which the department intends to modify to deliver to create a rural community where people want to live, work and be active in a sustainable and responsible way. Almost all respondents agreed that there should be a continued focus on tackling rural poverty and social isolation. The majority of respondents agreed with the 5 thematic pillars and the principles of the framework. And as part of the new framework, DAERA intends to establish a rural stakeholder oversight committee and subgroups that will act as an independent review and advisory body in respect of rural development policies. It also intends to build on learning from pilot initiatives such as the Website Development Programme, Rural Business Micro Business Support Scheme and the Food Business Investment Scheme to agree its priorities. Department has sought the committee's views on the outcomes and offered a further briefing once the Minister has had time to consider the findings and members' comments. And members, can I've taken a bit of a read through this here, and one of the things that jumps out at me is the Rural Stakeholder Oversight Committee, which the Minister hopes to have established by early 2022. Now, obviously, we and some of you may well have been involved in the leader methodology throughout what we had whenever we were within the EU, and some of you may well have been members of local action groups. And that was a good means of involving social partners, local councillors and local areas in looking at what the needs of local areas are and developing grassroots projects. So I would be very, I wouldn't just say concerned as yet, but I'd be certainly very curious to know how this Rural Stakeholder Oversight Committee and subgroups will be recruited. And they're hoping for it to be in place by early 22, and also, what sort of assurances will there be that grassroots communities will be involved in the identification and the managing of local rural projects? So that would be certainly a strong view that I have as someone who has, I have a fair bit of involvement in rural development over many years. So, remember, it's okay that we write to the department and for more clarification on this aspect of it. Anyhow, and if members have any other aspects as well that they want to raise, please feel free to mention it. Patsy.
Just on that, Chair, I've been surprised by how little emphasis has been placed within the document on COVID recovery, both, well, as we know, both economic and social. And that does surprise me some. The usual thematic areas are in there, but there seems very little emphasis in the document on COVID recovery. And we all know that we're dealing with people. And a huge issue, aside from access to services, a huge issue is stress, mental health problems, all those things emanating and maybe accumulating from COVID difficulties that people are having and inevitably will be facing into, whether that's through grief, loss, right across to loss of income, and just people generally been affected by it. And I'm a wee bit surprised that there hasn't been particular section dealt in that, including the economic recovery aspects of it.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Patsy. Is that something we can include in our, and members are happy that we get a briefing from the department, this, because I feel this is crucial, because obviously the likes of the Rural Stakeholder Oversight Committee they'll be developing this rural business and community investment programme, and I think it's absolutely crucial that grassroots communities are empowered and involved in this and the co-design of it from the very, very start. So, Patsy, your point about COVID recovery and that point, is that okay if we put these in correspondence to the committee, and that we get more information and perhaps a briefing from the department at the earliest possible opportunity?
Thanks, Chair.
Okay, members. Thank you. Members, we move on to item number 9. It's an oral briefing, the peatlands strategy. There's a tabled briefing paper from the department in your tabled packs. And I would like to welcome the departmental officials here this morning to give us the update. We have Mr. Dave Foster, the Director of Regulatory and Natural Resources, DAERA, Mr. Ken Bradley, Regulatory and Natural Resources Division, DAERA, and Ms. Rennie McKeown, Deputy Principal, Natural Heritage Branch, DAERA. And if you give the briefing, and then members will want to ask questions thereafter. So you're very welcome this morning, Rennie and
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, members. Thank you for the opportunity to brief you this morning. Certainly my team, as you mentioned, Chair, unfortunately Ken Bradley, who heads up the Natural Heritage Policy team, is having 1 or 2 connection problems, so he's not quite on the call yet. Hopefully he will join us in due course. And Rennie McKeown is with me, and she's the policy lead on peatlands. Also, I see Ken's joined us there, that's great. So I'm just going to give a few introductory words, Chair, before happy to take questions. So just in terms of context then, as members of course will be aware, there's now a global concern about both climate change and biodiversity loss, and tackling both of these threats requires a holistic approach, requiring the transformation of our society and economy, and also in recognising, addressing the challenges that face our environment. DAERA itself published our plan to 2050 recently, and we have committed as a department to protecting and enhancing our natural environment now and for future generations, whilst advocating its value to and well-being for all. And intrinsic to our success in that, we'll be putting into practice innovative ways to improve biodiversity and to protect our unique landscapes and ecosystems. DAERA also, on behalf of the executive, is developing a green growth strategy, as members will be well aware, and the associated climate action plan, as well as Northern Ireland's first environment strategy, and consultations on both of those are ongoing at the moment. The green growth strategy, which should be our initial route map into climate action, green jobs and a clean environment, as well as ensuring a just transition and supporting behavioural change in moving Northern Ireland to a low carbon, low emissions society. The conservation and restoration of our peatlands will be a significant tool to reduce our carbon emissions, and they're part of the solution for Northern Ireland to meet its new decade new approach and UK net zero commitments and our programme for government outcomes. In terms of the strategy itself and its background, the draft Northern Ireland peatland strategy was taken forward by staff in my division. We were guided by a project advisory board, the members of which were drawn from across DAERA, including colleagues in Forest Service and the College CAFRE, as well as some input from the National Parks and Wildlife Service in Ireland, which has a similar strategy to ourselves already developed. We also had representation in some of the latter meetings from Northern Ireland Water, as they own large areas of peatlands. There was also initial engagement during the drawing up of the draft strategy with a number of key stakeholders, including environmental NGOs and the UFU, to explain the rationale behind the development of a peatland strategy and to introduce early drafts with suggested outcomes and objectives. The draft strategy document was issued for consultation on the 9th of June this year, with a consultation period of 12 weeks, closing on the 1st of September. A summary document of the consultation responses has been produced and is with members, and subject to the views of the committee, it's proposed to publish this summary document on the DAERA website. In total, there were 67 responses to the consultation received, with respondents drawn from the environment sector, the agriculture and horticultural sectors, local government, community associations, academia, the forestry sector, renewable sector, utility companies, businesses, chartered institutes, elected representatives, and a number of individual responses as well. In general, there was support for the publication and implementation of a peatland strategy, although obviously, as with any consultation, a number of important issues were raised. In brief, the summary of the main issues raised would be centering around ensuring that the scope and ambition of the strategy is right, both in terms of the outcomes we seek to achieve and the timescales to achieve them. The need for ongoing and meaningful consultation with stakeholders and local communities. The issue of peat extraction and the use of peat-based growing media. The need, perceived or otherwise, for removal of forestry from peat soils. The need for upskilling and building a capacity in peatland restoration. This ties in with the issue of green jobs under the green growth strategy, and a need for a just transition for employees in the peat extraction industry. There was also a mention of a need for further research into peat alternatives and a need for increased knowledge transfer around these. And there was a virtually unanimous call for adequate and sustained funding for peatland conservation and restoration, on a par with that dedicated by the jurisdictions in the UK and Ireland. In terms of next steps, subject to the use of the committee today, we will then finalising the strategy in a number of steps. So we would hope later this month or early next month to publish the summary of consultation responses on the DAERA website. And then in the next couple of months, we'll be working on the revision of the strategy document in the light of consultation responses and discussions today. Then during March, February and March, we would then hopefully be going through a process of clearing and agreeing the final strategy document for publication. And then April 22 onwards, developing the implementation plan, establishing stakeholder partnerships and appropriate governance structures to oversee implementation of the strategy. Thank you very much for your attention. Myself and colleagues will be happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Dave. I suppose there's a couple of things. See, in terms of, obviously, we are currently consulting on, well, we will be consulting very soon on the new agricultural policy. Obviously, this is going to have a huge impact on farmers, particularly those who have peatlands. Has this policy been designed or developed in partnership with the new agricultural policy? And how do you propose to work with the farming community to bring them on board? Because a lot of these peatlands, indeed a lot of them in the west where I live, are owned by farmers, are privately owned by farmers and other landowners.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Certainly the work on the peatland strategy has been cognizant of the ongoing work on the future agricultural policy framework, which I think the Minister is hoping to consult on very shortly. I'm personally on the overseeing board for the agricultural policy framework, so we've been careful to ensure that the two are as complementary as possible. And you're quite right that in terms of implementing the strategy, a large majority of peatlands are on lands owned by the farming community, and so any actions to maintain or restore peatlands will be dependent on the buy-in and support of the farming community. So we're very cognizant of that, and very much see going forward that the opportunity for farmers to be supported and rewarded for delivering public goods that are associated with peatlands, such as carbon sequestration or improving water quality, perhaps need to be something that's reflected in future agricultural policy schemes. And so there are a number of work streams within the agricultural policy programme looking at agri-environment, looking at carbon, and both of those and other schemes, will be cognizant of the need to ensure that peatland restoration and ongoing maintenance are supported, as appropriate within future agricultural policy, and the strategy and policy are complementary.
Yeah, and just drawing on that there, you did recognise that, that this obviously will have an impact on farmers and our landowners in rural areas. So will there be like a rural impact assessment or an equality impact assessment carried out into this policy? And indeed, I'm thinking too of the economic impact, because there are many low-income households in rural areas that they cut peat, they cut turf to keep their homes warm. So there's obviously there's an issue to do with fuel poverty there as well. So will all of those factors be taken into account? The social, the economic, the rural needs and equality impacts be considered in designing and developing this policy?
Yeah, certainly, Chair. It's a very good point. That we need to make sure that when we come to finalise the strategy and implementation plan, that we've got the assessments of impact completed, and certainly, we will be carrying out an equality impact assessment and a rural needs assessment. In doing that, recognise that it is a complicated issue, and in particular in rural areas, as you say, individuals do rely on peat currently, for heating. There are links there also to the energy strategy, in terms of when that comes out, what that might say about support, in rural areas for, future energy sources. So, we're keen to ensure that we get the correct analysis carried out, and that where we see links to other strategies that might support any policy changes we would seek to make from the peatland strategy, we recognise those and act on them.
And would you be considering the implications of the strategy for people's turbary rates?
Well, certainly within the consultation, we suggested that turbary rights would be something that it would be appropriate to consider and look at in more detail. And I think the proposal was that we carry out a more in-depth review, recognising the complexity of the issues, and the interaction of a number of rights there. People's own personal turbary rights and those of the right to enjoy property, along with commitments in relation to climate change and international commitments, and just how those different rights and responsibilities and commitments interact. And so there's an expectation that we would start work on that, and that it would take some time to tease those out and to talk to the stakeholders who are most closely involved with that, and that will be across a number of different sectors.
Thank you very much. And we'll move around the room. John? John, can you hear me?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah. Thanks for the presentation, first of all. It's good to see some movement and progress on this. A couple of things coming from the report, and not major issues at all, just clarification, I suppose, that I require. You spoke there, Dave, of the ongoing consultation with stakeholders in the community, and I'm glad to hear that, but can I ask very specifically, will that include, and I think you've referenced this already, will that include the environmental sector, who have a wealth of knowledge and expertise on this? So there's a resource there for the department, and it also means joined up working as things are progressed further. And secondly, the next steps that you referred to taking us up to April 2022, and I think you mentioned implementation around the April time. Can we be assured that an action plan, a programme will be in place when we reach April 2022, and that progress at that stage will not be delayed by the election period? I would be hopeful that things will be in place before the natural break for the election period.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I will. Answering the second question first, John. The recognising things are tight when it comes to the current mandate and the pre-election period. We'll be seeking to get the final strategy agreed by by April, and in parallel, beginning work on the implementation plan. Certainly recognising that we don't want to be standing still. There will be obviously some things that would need to take views of the incoming minister on, but there'll be certain actions that we can begin work on ongoing now. You mentioned the environmental sector, and certainly I'll let Ken and Rennie maybe just give some more details, but we have been engaging with them during the course of the development of the strategy on an ongoing basis, and recognising that a number of environmental organisations are involved in current peat restoration pilot projects funded by the Interreg programme. But maybe Ken, do you want to say anything more about interaction with the environmental sector and sort of implementation plans?
Yeah, surely, Dave, will do. You're quite right, Dave. You mentioned there also wildlife and doing the 2 restoration pilots. They're also currently engaged on a process to identify basically the baseline of peatlands in Northern Ireland, the extent of peatlands, the depth of peatlands, and also to assess overall condition. That will then form a baseline of where we start from in terms of going forward in conservation or restoration. And so you're right, the partnership approach, as Dave has mentioned, is very important. And peatlands is a very complex issue, and within the department we've got some knowledge, some scientific knowledge, but it is an evolving process, looking at management and restoration and different methodologies of restoring peatlands, a very long-term process.
Thank you, Ken.
Okay. You, John?
Sorry, Jack, on the implementation plan. Yes, as Dave said, we will be starting development implementation plan. Once the strategy is published out there, and from the very early views, the committees, as the chair and yourself had expressed, it will be a very complex document, taking some time because there's a number of different parameters involved, different issues within peatlands, and it will take some time. So the idea is to get it right, get everybody on board, work in partnership with all different individuals and sectors, and get as much buy-in as we can, and obviously linked to resources. So we'll be, sorry for interjecting there.
Okay. Thank you. And John, Rosemary?
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. I just want to follow up perhaps on, Declan, what you had started. It was in relation to the Turbary rights. Coming from Fermanagh, you'll obviously be aware that we have quite a number of wind farms. And I know when these wind farms, some of them were set up on the highland, peatland areas, it took a considerable amount of time to investigate these and look at these, etc., etc. So I think that's going to take quite a bit of time and something that you're going to have to work through. So that's one thing, is just a comment on those. Next thing, you talked about the communicating with the stakeholders in the community, and obviously my interest would be the agricultural community. What sort of meetings have you had with the agricultural community, and what sort of communication with them?
Yeah, thanks very much, Rosemary. In terms of the first point about the wind farms and peatlands, you're certainly right. There can be complicated issues there, and I'm aware of obviously a number of significant incidents in the past 12 months where things haven't gone right. So I think operational colleagues have been looking at that, the Environment Agency and the others, and I think we look to seek to take the learnings from that and as appropriate implement it. Any changes needed in policy with colleagues in other departments, particularly DFI, obviously in the planning side of things. In terms of engagement with the agricultural community, as I mentioned in the opening comments, we'd been talking to the UFU in the development of the strategy to keep them on appraised of sort of our initial thinking, and going forward, when it comes to implementation, one of the proposals was to establish some form of stakeholder partnership. Making sure we've got a wide breadth of inputs from different sectors and interests, and certainly, the land managers and the agricultural sector and the horticulture sector would be key stakeholders to be involved with that. I don't know whether Rennie or Ken, you got any more detail on the specific interactions during the process thus far?
Surely, Dave. I'll come in there, and Rennie can follow on if need be. Yes, we have engaged with the UFU. I think it's a Hill Committee that's set up within the UFU. We have engaged with them on the development of strategy, and obviously they'll listen to our views and concerns and things like that there. And as Dave said, that engagement will be probably ramped up when we go forward in development. What can really the meat of the strategy, what we're going to do, when we're going to do it, and who's going to help do it. And again, learning from our colleagues in the south of Ireland who have a strategy in place a few years now, and also learning from likes of, I talked about also wildlife doing restoration. They had one-to-one meetings, with civic landowners to get them on board to explain what they're doing, why they're doing it, the importance of it, and getting them on board. So obviously that works. That process works. We'll do more of that, and probably at a slightly higher level. But yes. Definitely.
Yeah, no, my concern would be, speaking to Ulster Farmers Union is fine, but I do think you also need to maybe tap a little further down and speak to individual farmers, perhaps at various meetings, although I know COVID situation is slightly different now, but I do think you need to have a little bit more engagement at the roots.
No, yeah, that's a fair comment, Rosemary. I'm just thinking, actually, in your own area, I accompanied the minister out to Corker Mountain over the spring, and he was very interested in the work there around restoration, supported by the Interreg program. And during the course of the day, we had several conversations with local landowners, and that was very insightful to see, how they'd approached it, what their initial concerns and expectations were, and how actually going through the process of working on restoration had, altered those concerns or brought in new things we just hadn't thought about until we actually got on the ground and looked in a bit more detail.
Yeah, because I think it also gives them reassurance. Also when you speak with them. And one other issue, and that is, you talked about rewarding. If you're going to have this impact on the agricultural community in relation to the peatlands, what rewards are likely to be there if farmers are losing part of their land to this peatlands project?
It's probably a little early to be specific on that, Rosemary, because the ministers are looking to consult on the broad outline of future agricultural policy and what future support schemes might look like within that. So I think we're probably just a wee bit sort of before we're able to be specific in detail around that. But certainly in the programme that's been looking at what future agricultural policy might look like. Those sort of factors have been, part of the conversation, and so, I think that as and when, the consultation on that comes out, that there'll be, hopefully, some reflection of that and a chance for, stakeholders to input into the future development around that.
Okay. Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Dave.
Hey, Rosemary. William.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again for the presentation. In relation to peat extraction, and I think the Chairman did touch on it, surely it's industrial scale peat extraction is the issue, not local. I'm quite sure, and I know there are some peatlands that they're very high, and actually lowering that peat down would maybe even be a help. How do you manage peat extraction? It'll be a very difficult job to do. How is that going to be managed?
Thanks, William. Maybe Rennie, you might want to just pick this one up in terms of the thought processes around this. Certainly very much recognising that there are different scales of extraction, and where the priorities lie will reflect that. Oh, you're on mute, Rennie.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, sorry. Yes, well, I think there's two aspects to peat extraction. There's the commercial level extraction, and there's temporary right level extraction. The commercial level is it's not huge amounts of commercial extraction in Northern Ireland at the minute. But that is under a planning regime, so they need planning permission for that. Turbary rights is a different thing. I mean, initially, way back in the 19th century, it was really a right for a farmer tenant to extract enough turf to heat his home for the winter, and that was a very sort of manual process using a spade. Now, generally speaking, there would be the odd exception. People don't cut turf now with spades. It's industrial machinery that's used. So although people are exercising their turbary rights, it's a sort of industrial level. So it's outside the planning permission regime. So I think we need to sort of analyse this issue and find a way where we can manage these processes, because the way that extraction is carried on at the minute is quite damaging for our peatlands. But we will have to have a conversation around this with stakeholders and seek alternatives around for example, if people are using turf to heat their homes due to fuel poverty, we need to tackle fuel poverty at source. So there's a job of work to do, and we need to have a lot of engagement over this issue and map out a way forward.
William, can I add to Rennie's comments? Your initial question there was about the commercial extraction of peat. Now, as far as I'm aware, the mode of travel for commercial extraction is reducing, and Bord na Móna, the semi-state body down south, has given undertaking to stop commercial extraction of peat in the very near future, and I suppose there will be a sort of then pressure on other peat extractors in Northern Ireland to do similar, or again within the strategy, that's something as rises we could look at, because I suppose the overarching policy in the UK and international arena is to stop the commercial extraction of peat, at some stage, and that's work with the industry on that.
I think if I'm right, am I right in saying in the Irish Republic, I think there is a ban or partial ban on extraction of peat, but that created another problem with boatloads of it coming in from other areas. So I'm told that there's large consignments of peat then been imported. So you just doesn't you export the issue to some other place. You understand?
Yes, William, a valid comment and very true. Again, with DAERA are making moves to ban the import of peat from Eastern Europe or elsewhere, and they're looking at peat alternatives. So they are as growing medium and things like that there. So again, the travel will be reduced. The amount of peat coming in will be reduced, and again, over time, bit by bit, the idea is to stop both the commercial extraction and the import. But again, that can't happen overnight. It has to be done in a protected way, so it can.
Okay, thank you.
And folks, just before we finish up there, couple of wee points. We had a very informative site visit to Peatlands Park in Dungannon during the Halloween recess. The committee did, and we learned there that I think 86% of our peatlands aren't in good shape, and they're actually carbon emitters as opposed to carbon absorbers. See, with a fair wind, you know, how long do you think it would take for your strategy to actually transform our peatlands to make them carbon absorbers? You know, obviously, and do you think that would be sufficient? What you have planned is sufficiently ambitious, you know, to help meet our climate agenda locally?
I guess that's the $64,000 question, Chair. I probably have to defer to the scientists around how long it might take to turn peat from a net emitter to a net absorber. But it's certainly something we're very cognizant of need to to make early progress on. I don't know whether Ken or Andy, you got any more information on that, or is that one for the scientists to come back on? We could maybe revert to you if there's any more information out there we haven't got with us today.
Yeah. Okay, Dave, I'll maybe add a slightly bit more. It is obviously a very valid question, and because the strategy sets out we want to manage and restore peatland because it is in such a bad state overall, and you're right, 86% is the figure that's been quoted. Like everything else, it'll take time, and peatland by its nature is very slow to develop, and therefore even slower probably to restore. So we're talking about, decades, and obviously it takes time, effort, and finance, as most things do. But so therefore the idea is whatever resources we can get within existing or bid for, the idea would be to look for, say, where was the best value for money? In other words, where can we restore most peatland with the fewest amount of pounds and the least effort, and to try and get that target up very quickly within the next 15, 20 years. Our strategy is to 2040, but it's maybe, to be honest, in peatland terms, that's nothing really. So that's only really the start of the process in actual practical terms. While our strategy sets out the policy direction, our implementation plan will start the wheels in motion to get where we want to be, but we're under no illusion, that it is going to be a long-term thing. And that goes back to your earlier question about long-term commitment to local farmers and landowners who want to enter into that process of restoring their peatland. They need to have a long-term commitment from government on that, and that's where we want to see it.
And would you be, just sort of related, you mentioned the funding, what, in terms of the funding, what steps have been taken to secure that adequate funding? Are you confident that there is adequate funding in place to deliver on the strategy?
Well, certainly, Chair, as you I'm aware, and you mentioned earlier in the meeting about the budget consultation that is ongoing, and certainly, the department within that had put in a bid for fairly substantial funds to support the green growth strategy and its implementation. And so we've been having conversations with the green growth team, around, what elements of any funding that comes through in the final budget for green growth can be allocated to peatlands, and it's certainly seen as an important element of the climate action plan that's within the current consultation on the green growth strategy. So we're having those conversations, and the bids are in, and certainly there's a recognition that we need to make sure an adequate level of funding is available, and it needs to be a significant amount. We're cognizant of other devolved administrations have already established programs around this. I think the Scottish Government have a fairly substantial one, I think £250 million over a number of years. So, it's a very important element to get in place for the implementation plan. Just in terms of that last conversation with Ken about, how quickly can we turn things around? We had mentioned earlier in this session around the work that's going on through the Interreg program, and some of the pilots, and that they'll be coming to an end in the next year or so. There's the CAN project, and there's also a project the Northern Ireland Water are doing with Forest Service that are looking at peatland restoration. So, they'll start to give us some indication of, just how effective restoration techniques are and over what time scale they can start to make a real impact. And so ourselves and our operational colleagues in NIEA will really sort of use that information and information from elsewhere in other jurisdictions in the UK and Ireland, to help us to, get some more realistic estimates of how quickly things can move from the current bad state that a majority of our peatlands into a better state.
And see, just before we finish off here, Dave, you mentioned about other jurisdictions. Where would our draft peatland strategy sit in terms of ambition in relation to other jurisdictions in terms of, say, hectares or percentage of peatlands that we're aiming to get restored?
Ken or Rennie, have we any specific information on that? I know we've been looking very closely at what other jurisdictions have been doing, and we're all at slightly different stages in the sort of strategy policy process, but there may be more specific information on that.
Muted, Rennie?
Yeah.
You're muted, Rennie.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having trouble with the technology here. Well, the ambition in the strategy is to have all of our peatlands in good condition. But as Dave mentioned earlier, it's not an overnight process. It takes time, though. So some of the research has indicated that peatlands, given the right circumstances, can start to recover relatively quickly. But if you bear in mind that peatlands in Ireland started forming after the last ice age 10,000 years ago, it's not a quick process. So our ambition, really, to come back to the question, is to have all of our peatlands in good condition. There's about 12% of land cover, roughly, in Northern Ireland is semi-natural peatland, with about 18% of Northern Ireland comprising peat soils. So we need to make a start. There's been quite a lot of good work already being done, as Dave mentioned, in our pilot projects. And as time goes on, we will build on our experience and move the process forward. But I think initially we'll be looking to get the most bang for our buck in terms of carbon sequestration and biodiversity. So we'll be looking to start, on sites that give us a good return. How long it's going to take, it takes peatlands a long time to recover, but we can start the process, hopefully we can ensure by 2040 at the latest that all of our peatlands are at least under restoration management and heading in the right direction.
And have you used a means to benchmark the sequestration of the peatlands? Obviously they could potentially play a huge part in terms of us reaching net zero.
Yes, there's it's kind of a complicated process, but part of the work that Ulster Wildlife are doing is to sort of determine the amount of carbon that's sequestered in particular peatlands. So all of that information is factored in, and there's been quite a bit of research, both within UK, Ireland, and globally around carbon sequestration potential of intact peatlands and degraded peatlands, and how much carbon we can expect to sequester when peatlands are restored. So there's work ongoing there, and these are all factors that are taken into account when we're doing our peatland restoration.
That's perfect. Well,
but it will certainly contribute to meeting our net zero targets. I mean, it's part of the solution.
Thanks very much. Thank you for that, Rennie. Okay, I don't have any other members down to ask any more questions. I want to thank the three of you, Dave, Rennie and Ken, for coming here this morning and giving us a briefing and answering our questions. And I want to wish you a happy Christmas, and we'll probably be seeing you again in the new year. Okay.
Thanks so much, Chair. Members, happy Christmas to you all as well.
Okay, all the best. Bye-bye now.
Yes, happy Christmas.
Happy Christmas. Take care now. Bye-bye. Okay, members, we're going to move on here now to item number 10 on the agenda. It's an oral briefing, the Sheep Scab Control and Eradication Group. It's to do with the levels of the sheep scab in our flocks. And page 309 of the papers is a copy of the Towards Eradication report by the Sheep Scab Control and Eradication Group on its proposals for controlling sheep scab here. I want to welcome Paul Crawford, the coordinator of the Sheep Scab Control and Eradication Group. Paul, very welcome this morning.
Thank you very much for your time.
Okay. Want to lead off there, Paul, and members might want to ask questions thereafter?
Yeah, I'll give you a brief introduction. I'm here on behalf of the industry. In 2019, industry members, farmers, vets, and people in the pharmaceutical supply trade all came to a recognition that there seemed to be a lot more sheep scab about the country than there had been over the previous number of years. Sheep scab originally had been controlled by compulsory dipping, but this was abandoned in the early 90s for a number of reasons, but significantly due to concerns about the human health implications and the environmental implications of the main product used at that time, organophosphate dips. Sheep scab is caused by a parasitic mite. It's highly transmittable and it moves from flock to flock, even without direct contact between the sheep. And this happens because the mites can live off the sheep for up to 16 or 17 days. So they can survive in little bits of wool that can be blown or carried by birds from flock to flock, or left on the wire or at a hedge line, and then an adjacent flock come into contact with them. It can be spread by straying sheep walking down the road, and anyone who knows sheep, if stray sheep walk near your flock, the first thing the flock does is run up to the fence or to the gate to investigate who the strangers are, and that the mite is passed on. It can be purchased in, the sheep can be purchased in without showing any clinical signs. Clinical signs can take several weeks or even months to manifest themselves on a sheep after it's been infested. So you can go to a market and inadvertently pick up or buy in sheep that have scab on them. And if you don't have good control processes in place, then that can then spread to the rest of your flock. So the industry realised that there was a problem. The problem being that the mite causes the sheep to become highly irritated and very, very itchy, incredibly so itchy that in time, if it's left untreated, they will forgo everything else to spend their time scratching and nibbling at their skin, slowly starving themselves to death simply because they're spending so much time scratching and nibbling. There are effective treatments. There is the organophosphate dip, which we mentioned, and there are also injectable products. Unfortunately, there's already resistance in GB mainland, but we're not certain of the situation in Northern Ireland to all three of the injectable products. And it's inevitable if we keep using them in Northern Ireland without a control strategy in place to get rid of this mite once and for all, then resistance will develop here as well. And that'll only leave us with the organophosphate dips. And inevitably, if we keep using the organophosphate dips, resistance will in turn develop to those products as well. So while we still have the opportunity, we want to get control of the disease and we want to push towards eradication. It will require an all-island approach. The mite does not respect the border. Sheep grazing in flocks along border areas will be at risk from mites on the southern side of the border. So it has to be, at the end game, an all-Ireland approach, but it's an opportunity for us in the north to take a lead on this serious welfare problem of sheep. There's already significant progress being made in Scotland, England and Wales towards scab control and eradication. Only for COVID, the Welsh sheep industry had been promised a £5 million grant from their Welsh Assembly, and that was going to be to roll out a national control and eradication programme. That has been stalled by COVID, but there's indications from the Minister and from the group that they're very keen, once the situation on the ground allows, to restart that project. England have 3 major pilot projects running currently to develop the research knowledge and the technical expertise on the ground to deliver a national control and eradication programme. And Scotland are just a little bit behind on the curve. They were very active in the early noughties, and then for internal reasons, things sort of stalled a bit. But I know there's impetus to get control programmes up and running in Scotland in the very near future. So I'm happy to take questions on anything I've said or anything that's in the briefing, or if you just need any further clarification.
Thank you very much for that, Paul. Paul, I wonder, could you just elaborate a little bit more? What actual impact does this have on the sheep? I know it's a parasitic mite. What actual impact does it have on the sheep's health?
Okay. The mite lives on the surface of the skin and doesn't actually burrow into the skin, but nibbles on the surface of the skin, and that makes the sheep very itchy. As they start scratching, they get wool loss and they get little scabby lesions, hence the name of the disease on the fleece. Not all sheep are equally affected. Some breeds seem to be a little bit more resistant, or at least a little less sensitive to the mites and don't itch quite so much. Sheep can be infected time and time again. They can be infected, treated, and this can lead to a level of immunity. They never develop a protective immunity that stops them getting the disease, but it means that the signs in those sheep that have had the disease several times can be a whole lot less than sheep that have never had the disease before. So you can get a situation where farmers may have scab in their flock, but because of the breed and because of repeated exposure to the mite, the sheep don't show very many signs, but they're carrying lots of mites, and as soon as they come into contact with a naive flock through movement or sale, then that mite will spread. So wool loss is the most obvious sign that you'll see if you're driving around the countryside. Wool on the wire, wool on the fences, wool loss on the sheep, and the sheep standing, nibbling, particularly their shoulders, because that's the bit they can reach with their mouth, or rubbing their sides and hindquarters on fences and gates. Weight loss will follow because of lack of eating, and in time, either secondary infection to the skin or pneumonia or simple starvation will cause their death. Economic cost to flocks has been estimated in the region of £1,000 to £2,000 per flock of 300 breeding ewes, and that's a recent estimate from GB Mainland. And we would think that from the very limited research there is in Northern Ireland and talking to people, that's probably a realistic figure for some of the larger flocks in Northern Ireland whenever they get an outbreak. You're talking a four-figure sum to deal with the problem, and that's not fully including all the consequential losses through loss of production, potentially loss of live weight gain, taking longer to reach a slaughter weight, reduced wool production, damage to hides, and then the environmental impact of all the extra feeding required to get these sheep back up to normal body condition and growing again. And finally, there's a welfare cost, a significant welfare cost to the farmer. This is a disease that strikes fear into the heart of sheep farmers. They don't like it. They don't like seeing it in their neighbourhood. It causes them anxiety and it causes them a great deal of distress whenever it's in their flock. And that's something that can't be underestimated, particularly with the amount of strain there's already on the mental health of our farming community.
And Paul, just before we move around, there's a couple of members who want to ask questions. Obviously, we export a lot of sheep. I think we're around 500,000 sheep per year. We export even into the south and indeed to this as well. Do you think ultimately this could damage the industry, and particularly at a time when we need to, we're going to be very reliant on exports to a lot of parts of the EU? And also, has there been any assessment of how widespread this is amongst the flocks here, and what it might cost for the department to introduce an eradication programme? Or indeed, what has the department taken any steps at all to introduce an eradication programme?
Right, I'll try and remember all those questions. Export-wise, currently it's not appearing to cause a barrier. One of the reasons we have been given for maintaining the notifiable status of the disease in Northern Ireland is export status, but no clarification really came from the department as to where that direct link was. Certainly, from a welfare point of view, we know from within the group's experience that there are sheep with obvious clinical scab reaching abattoirs in Northern Ireland, and that's not unreasonable. It's a good option. If the sheep are near slaughter weight, it's probably the most effective thing to do. It solves their welfare problem. It takes those scab mites out of circulation, and it also reduces the amount of chemicals we need to use to control the programme. But if those sheep go into another jurisdiction carrying scab, and their veterinary surgeons at the plant take a different view of the wisdom of moving sheep with sheep scab direct to slaughter, then that potentially could cause a significant problem. But I think the prevailing wisdom at the minute is that slaughter is a very effective solution to the problem because it, as I said, deals with the welfare problem and it mitigates medicine use. Regards to cost, no, there simply isn't enough data to develop a fully costed model for control of eradication. There's next to no published data in Northern Ireland. As part of my Harper Adams University PhD, which is DAERA funded, thank you DAERA, which is DAERA funded, we have done a little bit of work, and that's currently being analysed and going to peer review. So that should be out in the springtime in some form, some information from that analysis once it's been analysed and peer reviewed. But that's the only thing that there is currently about Northern Ireland. For that particular project, we didn't ask enough questions. It wasn't a big enough survey to establish what it would cost to control and eradicate scab in Northern Ireland. But it was clear from that there's more sheep scab about in Northern Ireland than the official DAERA figures would suggest. As for DAERA action, there has been a little bit very recently. In the last couple of weeks, I've had notification that they're going to update the information on the website. Previously, the website had simply said sheep scab is notifiable and present in Northern Ireland, and that was about it. They've acknowledged that that needs to be adjusted, and work is going into updating that information. I have had direct contact with DAERA officials. They have been observers at the Scab group since its inception, and we have had a number of conversations around what our plans and our thoughts might be on some of the policy implications and legislation implications. But yeah, fundamentally, they're not doing a whole lot. Some farmers would suggest that they have enough officials in enough marts and enough abattoirs that they should be seeing a little, and on the road, they probably should be seeing a little bit more than that's currently the current figures would suggest. So there's possibly an immediate role just for a refocusing. We know that they focus very well on spotting lame cows and lame sheep going into abattoirs and into markets. It's maybe time they put some energy into scratchy sheep as well.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, I'm going to pass around the room here. Patsy?
Okay.
Patsy?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And Paul, good to see you again. Thanks for your briefing. Could I just ask one question there? It relates to the various treatments that do exist. And you mentioned in your briefing, resistance to 3 of the 4 licensed products has been demonstrated in mites found on sheep in GB.
Yes.
Can you just advise what that means and what is the licensed product, the final one that seems to be effective yet?
Okay, so there's 3 injectable products. They're all chemically closely related. There's ivermectin, doramectin, and moxidectin. And they're widely available through vets and farm merchants under a number of different generic brand names. And most of the farming community will be familiar with at least 2 out of any 3 of those. The resistance has been demonstrated to each of those because they are so closely chemically related. Just as we found with gastrointestinal worms, when we see resistance to one of those 3 products, resistance to the other 2 is not very far away or currently there. What resistance means in a clinical situation is, or on a farm, is if I go into a farm and inject all the sheep and I know that I've given them the correct dose for their weight, I've weighed every sheep, I've used a really good dose gun that's really accurate, I've made sure the injection goes in the right place. And that's important because each of the products has a specific site that it needs to be injected. One's in the muscle, one's under the skin, and the third one is under the skin, but specifically at the base of the ear. So even those simple things, knowing which site it needs to go to, can be a problem for prescribers and farmers. But the resistance issue means that instead of the sheep over the next 10 days stopping itching and getting better, you may see some stopping itching and you may see some itching a little bit. And then very quickly the mites start to resurge, and they all start itching again. Very rarely is there absolutely no response to treatment. Very rarely is the entire population of mites 100% resistant to the treatment. But there's enough mites survive that then reinfest the flock and propagate the problem. And because you've killed off the ones that are resistant and only left the ones that are, you've killed off the ones that are sensitive and only left the ones that are resistant, that means you've just increased the population of resistant mites and increased the potential for them to spread into other flocks. So the one remaining product is the organophosphate dip. And at the minute, we have no demonstrated resistance to the dip. So there are some situations where dipping is not necessarily the most appropriate treatment, but controlled dipping with trained operators is probably the first choice at the minute to protect the injectable products from further development of resistance, not only for the sheep scab mites, but also the intestinal worms, which is a big enough problem in Northern Ireland already without increasing the amount of resistance in the intestinal worms. Because whenever I inject one of those products into a sheep, the product doesn't know I just want it to go to the skin and kill the mites. It goes through the whole sheep, and all the intestinal worms will also be exposed to the product, driving further resistance in the worm population as well.
So can I just ask one other thing just about the dipping? Dipping obviously is done certain times of the year and all that sort of thing, but is it advisable to dip when you establish or see the mites in a herd, or dip prior to that? In other words, does every herd have to be dipped? Basically, is that where this process takes us, or is it no circumstances where mites are seen to be starting to manifest in a herd?
Yeah, well, what we as an industry for some time now, we've been adopting what we call the test, don't treat approach. So only using treatments, whether it's for intestinal worms, liver fluke, or sheep scab, but make sure of your diagnosis first. And that reduces the driver for resistance. It also reduces the environmental damage, because all the products we're using, the injectable products and the dip, have environmental consequences as well as economic consequences for the farmer. So dipping, from an overall disease control point of view, dipping would be our first choice at the minute because of the resistance levels. But there are some flocks or certain times of year that dipping may not be appropriate. A small flock, it's not going to be economic or sensible to fill a dip bath with 600 litres of dip concentrate of dip to dip 30 sheep. Very bad weather. If the weather's forecast to be going to rain for the next 3 weeks solid, there's no point trying to wait to get the weather good to dip them. You need to treat them. You need to treat them now. So dipping requires reasonable weather for a couple of days beforehand, a couple of days after. So the sheep are dry, so the dip soaks right in, gets into their skin, gets into their ears, everywhere else, doesn't get diluted, and then it doesn't get washed off as soon as they go out of the bath. So you need it to be dry for a couple of days. So some times of the year, some weather forecasts. And then, of course, dipping requires certain certification to be in place. The operator needs to be trained and certified to purchase and use the dip. And there needs to be a groundwater authorisation for the waste dip to be disposed of afterwards. Neither of those processes you can just turn on overnight. So if you have a flock outbreak tomorrow and you don't have a groundwater authorisation, or you don't have a certificate of competency or a friend who has one, then you're forced at the minute to inject. So there are practical reasons why we have to go one way or another. But if we were developing a control programme, we would look to try and mitigate by increasing the pool of approved dippers to try and keep the pressure off the injectables.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Paul.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. Rosemary?
Thank you, Paul. Good to see you again.
And you.
Paul, I was just interested. You talked about the injectable products and you said, why is there resistance? That is resistance from the mite, not from the veterinary world.
No, it's resistance. The mite is resistant to the effects of the drug. The mite will not roll over and die and fall off the sheep.
Okay, and then you talked about the sheep dipping with organic phosphates. Can I ask you, do you foresee in the future to get rid of this mite? You obviously talked about slaughter being the most effective solution. That's not going to be possible with breeding ewes, etc., etc. We've got to find another way. And at the moment, it seems to be edging towards edging towards the dipping of sheep. Do you, or would you like to? Would you suggest, or would it be? What's the situation? Would you suggest that sheep should be perhaps dipped twice a year, and have every farmer have a programme for dipping sheep with these professionals, if you have a number of professionals available?
No, I think that would probably be unnecessary and potentially overkill, an expense to the industry and an expense to the environment. We would be looking to very much to target treatment.
Okay.
So what would we want to do is work out where the sheep scab is. So in some initial work, farmers self-report, they say, we think we've got sheep scab. So we go and visit them. We find out where it might have come from by investigating their local area, their neighbours, recent purchases. And then we go to those farms, and you can use a blood test. There's a very effective blood test now. We don't have to wait for the sheep to start itching. So if we go to a farmer and we say, okay, you've definitely got sheep scab, we can test the neighbours. And if the neighbours come up clean, that's fine. We tell them you no need to dip, no need to treat. Just make sure you keep up on your biosecurity. You're doing well so far. If we find there is scab in one of the flocks, then we have a conversation with them about the most appropriate treatment. Then we ask them, have they bought or sold anything recently? And then we follow those tracings. And again, take the same approach, get to that farm, talk to the farmer, look at the sheep. If it's not obvious what's going on, blood test them. If they're clean, move on. If they're not clean, repeat the process. But the one thing we don't have is enough information to work out how many contacts there are going to be in those webs, how complicated those webs are going to be. And that's why the initial phase of any work would be to gather some data to try and work out, to try and build a model, to try and populate a model to say how many of these contacts in all directions there are going to be from each of the sheep farms, and thus what the likelihood of the expense is. So that's, you know, we definitely don't want to go back to a situation of a national dipping program, because people who don't think they have a problem, some of them will be tempted to either skip it or undertreat. And then if there is anything happens to be in their flock and they're just putting a wee splash of dip in the bath and not measuring it out properly, then that's going to drive resistance. It's going to cause other problems. So we definitely don't want to be going back to a national programme.
Would you therefore, Paul, find that there are pockets of Northern Ireland that are more prone, obviously, to this sheep scab than other areas? You know, is it the more mountainous areas? Is it the more lowland areas? Is it different breeds of sheep?
A little bit of all of those. A little bit of all of those, and depends on the time of the year. Evidence from other parts of of GB and Southern Ireland would suggest that there are areas where sheep scab is resident all year round. It's in flocks, particularly in some of those more extensive areas. So the sheep don't come in contact with many other sheep. There's not a lot of transmission from sheep to sheep. They tend to be the long wool hill varieties who tend, as a group, to be that little bit more resistant to, or a little bit less sensitive to the mite. So they don't show the obvious signs. It slowly circulates around a flock, so they develop a certain amount of immunity. So they're not pulling all their wool out, they're not stopping eating, but it sort of slowly circulates around in those endemically infested flocks. Then come the autumn time, people store lambs, they sell breeding sheep. They go down into the lowland areas in particular, or they head off on their winter holidays to winter grazing. They meet naive sheep who have never met it before, different breeds who are maybe a bit more sensitive. And then September, October, November through to January, February time, you see a spike in the numbers of cases that are being identified, but they tend to be in the lowland areas. But we anticipate, and again, we need some pilot data to confirm this, but we anticipate that Northern Ireland will be the same as Scotland, England, Wales and Southern Ireland, that there will be areas where it's chronically, where the mite lives all year round, causing a low-grade problem that doesn't really cause the sheep or the farmer a problem, but it does cause the neighbour or the next man in the chain a problem when animals move out of those areas. That was one of the findings when they were talking about the original eradication from GB mainland in the 1950s. That was one of the real lessons that came out of that's got forgotten in the course of time. If you go back to the literature of the 1950s, you find them talking about how these hill farmers didn't realise that they had a problem that was causing somebody else further down the production cycle a massive heartache. And when it was explained to them and when it was laid out to them what the problem was and how they could be part of controlling the problem, that was one of the key drivers to finish off the eradication in GB mainland, which was effective for 20 plus years until they re-imported the disease. But we'll not talk about that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you.
Okay.
William?
Sorry? Paul, even if you did. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation. I see Australia, New Zealand, Norway and Sweden has eradicated the disease. What can we learn from them, or are they doing something different to us?
Well, New Zealand, again, they eradicated it very early on. They eradicated it at the turn of the previous century and around the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. And they took a decision as the farming community, before they even had veterinary laboratories or even vets in the country, that they wanted rid of this disease. And between a combination of bathing and slaughtering out flocks that they couldn't get control in, they eradicated the disease, and they just said, we're not having it in the country. They knew they should never have let it in the first place, but so they were on plan B, and they've kept it out for 130, 40 years since.
So obviously it's doable. It is, managing people at that time was when you'd have thought, you'd almost thought it would have been impossible, but
that's the irony, is that they had more success eradicating it from mountainous regions of New Zealand without quad bikes, drones, injections, modern dips, tests, or anything else. One comment from an Australian or New Zealand commentator at the time was, never underestimate the arachnicidal power of the rifle bullet. Don't underestimate the ability of slaughtering animals at getting rid of the arachnid, the parasitic condition. And that's something that the Welsh group have looked at on their control and eradication programme. They're aware that there are some hilly mountainous regions in Wales where there may be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 sheep that are away up in a crag somewhere that they cannot get off. And there's absolutely no point leaving 6 sheep out on a common or out on a mountain, because if one of them has got even one female mite on its fleece anywhere, you bring the other 2,000 sheep off the hill, treat them effectively and put them back on, that one mite is sufficient to re-establish a flock infestation. So the Welsh team have included in their budget drones for spotting these sheep, and they have included marksmen for taking out sheep that they can't round up, because they know the greater welfare good of the national flock is that a couple of sheep may need to be taken off the hill as carcasses, because they're not going to be able to drive every single animal in to be treated. That's a mindset. If you want to get rid of it, it's doable, but that's the sort of mindset you have to take. You have to say, right, we're going to do it, and do it. Because you literally leave one mite behind in the country and it's back.
And there's no vaccine or nothing that works.
No, there's no vaccine. There are people in Morden Research Institute are looking at vaccine technology, but the fact that sheep catch it time and time and time again, a bit like the common cold in humans or another virus in humans that we dare not mention, would suggest that vaccine technology is not necessarily going to be the answer. It may become, if control programs are abandoned and if resistance to OP dips becomes a reality, vaccines may be the only way to manage the disease, and we may have to give up on eradication. But there is still an opportunity at the minute to look for definitive control, because if we end up down the route of a vaccine, is the vaccine going to be given once for life, or once every 6 months, or once every 3 months? And is that going to become a burden to the industry? And what side effects may we see from repeated vaccination? So there is an opportunity still to eradicate the disease. So that's what the industry would look to.
I would have thought that looking at it from the outside, and I'm a farmer myself, I don't keep sheep, but eradication's at all, it looks to me going to be very difficult.
Yeah, it's not going to be. It's not going to be easy, but Ruminant Health have called for a UK-wide target to have sheep scab eradicated by 2031. So that's sort of the top level industry board view on the subject, and that's their sheep target for the next 10 years, is to get rid.
That's how it works.
Thank you. Right. And finally, John Blair.
Chair, thank you, and can I thank Paul again, and good to see him for the information given. Look, most of what I was going to ask has been covered, and specifically on an up-to-date position with the department, which we've heard of. So I'm happy enough to wait and see what the committee can do to try and get more clarification around the issue.
Yep. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you. As I have all the members present have asked questions, Paul, I want to take the opportunity to thank you for coming along here this morning and giving us your briefing and for answering all of our questions. And obviously want to wish you a happy Christmas as well. And we'll hope to see you again sometime, Paul. Okay?
Yeah. Can I just clarify one point, Declan, before you hit the button? The one thing that in the conversations that we have had with DAERA is around the aspect of data sharing, particularly around movements. And this is something that is not just an issue specifically for sheep scab, but it relates also to BVD control. And as government wants industry to take more and more control of disease and eradication, disease control programs, we need a one-off fix for how DAERA data and industry-led disease control programs can talk to each other, that is GDPR compliant and user-friendly on both sides. Because if government wants industry to take the lead on controlling and eradicating the various different diseases, we need access to the data of where animals are coming and going and moving around. And I say it's not just a sheep scab problem, it will come up time and time again until it's dealt with as holistically. And that would be sort of just one key thing that I think the committee would be in a strong position to influence that, and an all-island approach. I've had individual parties support for an all-island approach, and they have contacted colleagues in the south. But again, if the committee saw fit to support an all-island approach and raise that with our counterparts in Dublin, that would be greatly appreciated too.
That's great. Thank you for that, Paul. That's something we definitely take on board. So, Mayor, once again, thank you very much, and happy Christmas, and we'll be seeing you again, Paul.
Oh, aye, no doubt. Thanks, and happy Christmas to everyone.
Take care now. Bye, Paul.
Bye.
Bye now.
Chair, just to alert you that our next speaker is not yet in the audience, so I would suggest that we could move to item 12. Item
12. Okay, members. Item 12. We'll go back to item 11 whenever Professor Skey joins us. Item 12 is the single-use carrier bags charge amendment regulations NI 21. The Department has laid these regulations with the Business Office, and they can be found at page 337 of your packs. You will recall that we considered the SL1 on the 2nd of December, and there have been no changes to the policy since then. Are members content to refer the regulations to examiner statutory rules? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, member, we'll go on to item 13. Okay, there's a written briefing, the edible crabs undersized amendment order NI 21 and the SR 3321 edible crabs conservation amendment regulations 2021. The department has also laid regulations relating to reducing the minimum landing size of crabs and prohibiting declawing that we discussed several weeks ago. These papers are found at page 346 of your packs. Both rules are subject to negative resolution procedure. Member, are you okay we refer these to the examiner statutory rules? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I'll move on to correspondence. It's at page 360 of your packs. There's a number of pieces of correspondence that we received. Just want to highlight a couple of them. The common frameworks. The department has written to the committee advising that the cross-cutting issue on the common frameworks have been resolved and expects a small number of frameworks to be issued before Christmas for scrutiny, with the remainder published in the new year. Ministers have agreed, constitutional ministers have agreed that the end of March 2022 will be the final deadline for parliamentary scrutiny. The department has provided information to support the potential prioritisation of common frameworks. Members, are you okay? Members, okay if we write to the House of Lords Common Framework Scrutiny Committee to seek their views on any issues they think we should be aware of? You know that? Yeah. And members, are you okay that we write to the department acknowledging the update and proposed end date for scrutiny, and that the committee will endeavour to meet this, but it may not be possible to facilitate extensive scrutiny of all frameworks given that the reduced time associated with the delay in frameworks to the committee? Okay. Okay, members. The other item corresponds is AFB appointments. Following discussion at our committee meeting on the 25th of November, the department has confirmed that due process was followed at the Commissioner for Public Appointments Code of Practice and its legal responsibilities in relation to board appointees. The department is satisfied that all candidates were required to demonstrate experience relevant to AFB's work, including experience or knowledge of the agriculture or food sectors and or of a business development or change management process in any sector, and that lawful steps were taken to encourage applicants from a wide pool of candidates which are reflective of the whole of the community here. Members okay to note this reply? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, members, okay, the other item corresponds is the cost of the climate change bill. The department has replied to the committee's queries and work carried out by the research department about the cost of the climate change targets, and the key points are as follows. DAERA intends to investigate with the CCC to seek clarity which will inform the appropriateness of amending its RIA. DAERA has highlighted the issue with regards that the RAIS did not examine the cost of pursuing net zero by 2045, and to date no substantive analysis has been carried out regarding this. DAERA has highlighted points of issue with the projection of costs from 2022 to 2050 and thereafter. DAERA has questioned whether it is appropriate or the best use of public money for the executive to cover the additional costs of pursuing a net zero 2045 target. Okay, members content that we request an update from the department when the CCC has provided clarity on the appropriateness of amending the RIA. Okay. Okay, members okay to action the correspondence as suggested in the in-text sheet, the remainder of the correspondence? Okay. Item number 15 is the forward work programme. Given that this is the last meeting of 2021, the committee team will use this opportunity to plan the committee's work for the remainder of the mandate. The new draft forward work programme has been brought forward before the committee at its first, will be brought before the committee at our first meeting in the new year. And are we content to facilitate a meeting on the 6th of January as previously communicated informally, and the clerk will confirm arrangements with members and staff via WhatsApp? It's okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Chair, excuse me, Professor Skey is now online. So.
Okay. Okay, members. We're going to go back now to item number 11, and then following item number 11, we'll jump on back to item number 16. Okay, members. Item number 11, we now have an oral briefing from Professor Jim Skea on the Just Transition Commission in Scotland. You will recall that we agreed to seek a briefing from the Just Transition Commission in Scotland on its history, role and function, further to our discussions over the past few months on climate change legislation. Professor Skey, Chair of the Commission, has kindly joined us today to discuss the work of the Commission. And Professor Skey, you're very welcome. We are very grateful for your attendance this morning, and we appreciate how busy you are at present. So I'd like you, if possible, take the opportunity to address the committee, and members may want to ask questions thereafter.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me at the moment. So I'll presume that you can, and just proceed and just say thanks for inviting me, and it's nice to visit Northern Ireland again, even if virtually. I've been many times. So just to introduce it very briefly, it's probably most value if you just ask me questions, but just to give a very quick introduction to it. In terms of just transitions in Scotland, there was actually a prehistory, and that way back in 2015 and 2016, the Scottish Trade Union Congress and Friends of the Earth Scotland got together to form a just transition partnership, recognising that there were big issues to resolve around, the transition to reduced greenhouse gas emissions and what it implied for employment and labour market. So they got together and pressed the Scottish Government to create a Just Transition Commission, which was actually established at the end of 2018 and carried out its work mainly through 2019 and 2020, and produced a final report at the start in spring 2021. So, the Commission, when it was established, it had representatives of all sorts of constituencies. So, 12 people altogether. That included businesses, trade unions, environmental groups, community groups, and just a small number of academics to support the process. And they worked through these 2 years. In the first year, having a lot of meetings outside Edinburgh and Glasgow, going to different parts of Scotland to talk about particular topics like the future of the oil and gas industry, the role of farming and agriculture. And when the report was produced in spring 2021, there were 24 recommendations altogether, all of which the Scottish Government says it accepts. But we group these into four themes, right? The importance of planning for a just transition, the idea that we should be planning at a sectoral level. Secondly, the importance of skills and retraining for people whose competences may need to be deployed in a net zero future. Third one was about the importance of local authorities and working at the community level, because that was the level at which people would be most engaged in the process. And we did a number of very specific and actually characteristic Scottish style recommendations on that. And then the final one was about the costs and benefits of just transition and who would be affected by the move to net zero. And with the idea that that people should pay where they can, but particularly disadvantaged groups should not find that the costs are unfairly burdened upon them. And a very specific example of that, most of the decarbonisation in Scotland and the rest of the UK has been paid for by electricity consumers. That's regressive in its effect, and given the emphasis on electricity decarbonisation in the future, that's a particular example that should be thought about. So as a result of the report, there have been a lot of developments. A Minister for Just Transition has been created, which is the first time that we understand globally that this has actually been the case. And there are going to be a set of just transition sectoral plans, starting with energy, but the second one that is slated will be for land use and agriculture, recognising the importance of these issues. And a new Just Transition Commission has been established, which I will be chairing again. And just yesterday, it was announced who the members of that new commission would be, and it's slightly enlarged. There will be a core group of members of the commission, and then slightly more revolving doors for each of the sectors that we pick up. So there are an additional 4 appointments that are specific to the energy sector. So the role of the Commission will be to scrutinise what government is doing on just transition, in particular these sectoral plans. It will be to think about ways of monitoring and evaluating a just transition as it takes place, think about the indicators that we need to pick out, and to continue the job that we started in the first Just Transition Commission about keeping engaged with stakeholders in the process. I'll stop there and really pretty much open up for questions, but one other point I just think would make, especially at the COP26 in Glasgow, there was a huge amount of attention to what Scotland had been doing this. It is perceived to have been a very interesting process, partly because it gets the just transition beyond just getting out of the coal industry and casting it much more widely in terms of the impacts of a move to net zero and what it implies for society and the economy more widely. And can I just say it was a very satisfying process to chair that first Just Transition Commission. The chemistry was extremely good, and the way that drew people together from different sectors of the community, different stakeholders and groups that were very keen to learn about the problems that were faced in other sectors and really sort of stick by each other. So from my point of view, the experience was a very positive one, but I'm very interested, obviously to hear questions from, members of the committee and respond to them as best as I can. And I'll draw the introductory remarks to a close there.
Thank you, Professor Skey. That was very interesting and very helpful. speech from yourself. I suppose one of the things that we are aware of here, that Scotland has, for example, the Agricultural Transition Fund. I think it's a £40 million fund that they have to enable agriculture and farmers to make the transition. Did that come out of the Just Transition proposals? And are there any other practical examples or schemes or initiatives that you could give us which has been introduced in Scotland to deliver this Just Transition?
Yeah, I mean, just to say that I think that happened independently of, the Just Transition Commission's, recommendations, because obviously the process of government in Scotland, was already addressing the net zero issue and what would actually be required. It's just to say, I mean, since you flag up the issue of agriculture and land use, we did have someone specifically from the agricultural sector on the Commission, to help guide us through the process for that sector. And it was Kate Roll, who is actually a tenant farmer herself. She's also a qualified vet. But her other role that was important to us, she was the chair of the organisation Quality Meat Scotland. And it wouldn't be very surprising that many of the farmers we talk to are very sensitive about the eat less meat kind of message that often comes up around climate change. And the role of Quality Meat Scotland is actually to act as the certification body for meat that is produced in a sustainable kind of way. And it's very important for us to get Kate's view and the views of the agricultural community in there. Scotland faces some particular issues because of the very high concentration of land ownership and the amount of tenant farming that is a feature of the system. And that there are particular challenges there with, for example, the Committee on Climate Change's message about converting agricultural land over to woodland. And that plays into this ownership structure in Scotland, the land tenure question, very, very strongly.
Okay. That's very helpful. And Timmy, just before I move around the room, see in terms of the Just Transition arrangements that you have in Scotland, are there any other examples of that type of transition commission or principles being implemented in other parts of the EU or across Europe?
I mean, it's worthwhile saying that actually what Scotland has done is being perceived as quite world-leading in the way that it, has sort of defined the scope of Just Transition. But just to say, there are many other efforts going in other parts of the world that go under that label. So, for example, the EU Green Deal and the Fit for 55, which is kind of their approach, the approach within the European Union for getting, a pathway to net zero in 2050 and the target for 2030, is that under the Green Deal, Just Transition plays a very important role, but it has been very focused on this question of exiting from the coal industry and providing funding for regions would be affected by the rundown of coal. And it's worthwhile remembering the whole Just Transition thing within the UN process really started with COP24 in Katowice, when the Polish presidency really pushed the issue of Just Transition with an emphasis on exiting from coal. So the question of funding for regions like Upper Silesia, parts of Eastern Germany, and Asturias in Spain, as you exit from a coal industry, was really the dominant feature. And it's actually quite a novelty for other issues like land use and agriculture to be brought within the Just Transition framing. And the big news around COP26 was a Just Transition declaration, which involved all the classic kind of principles. It involved basically several European EU countries, the UK, New Zealand and the US signed up for it. And the other message was the Just Transition Partnership at a higher level that was formed between South Africa and several developed countries to help fund and support a transition out of coal in South Africa. So internationally, the coal picture has dominated, but one of the things that the Scottish experience has helped to do is to broaden the definition and bring it into areas like agriculture and wider land use.
Thank for that. We'll move round. John?
Chair, thank you. Professor Skey, thank you for your presentation. The question that comes to mind most immediately for me, as you mentioned there, the Minister appointed for Just Transition, and it's, to say the least, above my pay grade to make any such suggestion for Northern Ireland, and probably outside the remit of this committee as well. But what I'm keen to know more specifically is, can you give us any oversight on the interdepartmental actions and frameworks, particularly formal frameworks set up to secure interdepartmental and joined up action, and if we could learn from that in Northern Ireland, whilst the Department for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs may well have the lead in many aspects of this, there are essential tasks to be carried out by other departments, in fact all other departments and public bodies, and therefore that joining up of resources is crucial.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And it's worthwhile saying that all of the Scottish Government's ministerial portfolios appear to come in threes. They're actually quite complicated. In the previous government, before the May elections, the main portfolio was environment, climate change and land reform, all bundled together. So this question of land was really seen as quite central to the climate change debate as well. And the new minister's full title is the Minister for Just Transition, Employment and Fair Work. So it's attaching it to these wider kind of fair work agendas as well. And what that kind of fluidity and combining different things in a portfolio means, there has to be a lot of joined up working within the Scottish Government itself. But the problem, the issue with Just Transition, frankly, it touches upon absolutely everything portfolio, and that's the challenge. And one of the main reasons for creating that ministerial post was to give somebody the kind of authority to go around the different parts of the government system and bang heads together, because you could not do it in just one single place. So I've had meetings with several of the ministers in the new government, from climate change, those are questioned, those concerned with the rural economy, which is quite a different portfolio. So it is recognised that Just Transition gets everywhere. It's a real Heineken, kind of policy topic. You need to cover it everywhere.
Okay, that's very useful information. So it's the case then, rather than the Minister for Just Transition having an individual budget and an individual remit, they have then, it would seem, more of an oversight role in what all of the other departments are doing. Is that correct? I think that's very, very fair to say that's the way that it will actually work. And just to say, with the tasks of the Just Transition Commission, for its next phase, which is going to be much harder because it's about the implementation phase, that monitoring and evaluation function, we don't have the resources. We will not have a secretariat that's able to do all the monitoring and evaluation. What we will be concerned with is trying to persuade other parts of government to do the analysis and the statistics that allows us to create the indicators and the measures to come to those. So there's an agency called Consumer Scotland, for example, and we will be very keen to talk to them about developing indicators as how the move to net zero affects different groups of consumers, and how we can develop the indicators and the measures to see what is actually happening. Who's being affected? Is it people in rural communities? Is it people who have to use electricity as the main source of heating for their home? How does it affect, relatively well-off middle-class families versus people who are living in social housing? These are the kind of issues that we will want to be getting a grip of. Okay. That's very useful. Thank you, Professor Skey.
Patsy? Patsy?
Hello, yes, Professor Skea, and thanks very much for giving of your time to the committee today. I had a number of inquiries, and I'd be interested, given that you're a few years ahead of us there in Scotland, around your Just Transition and your targets. Could you maybe outline to us that there's several things, and I was interested in what you were saying there about the cross-cutting aspects of this. Clearly it affects every government department and public body. But if I could maybe run through these, there's number of challenges, as we know, and it'll be interesting to hear how those have been met. Say, for example, support to farming on awareness, education, skills adaptation, and moving along to where they need to move to meet the challenges that are associated with net zero and try and mitigate the worst aspects of climate change and their activities, as do other sectors as well. But if we could maybe just look at that and see how you have identified what support's required in various aspects, be those educational, skills acquisition, or indeed financial support measures that are necessary for various sectors, not just agriculture. But moving on from that, if you could give us some sort of an indication as to what you did as a committee to outline to people the opportunities, the economic opportunities that also exist job-wise within the transition. And then there's one other aspect which, where I live, is very rural, and the public transport isn't that great, and probably if I were to leave here to use the public transport network to try and get to Stormont, my current 3/4 of an hour trip by car would probably take me about 3 years, so that's just not feasible. I am very concerned at aside from the fact that we heard on the news this morning the necessity for EV charging points and improvement in that, we also heard the fact that one of the major companies might be considering charging financially for those as well. But my big concern is that we could have what we'll call it mobility poverty, in that people aren't able and won't be able to afford the electric vehicles, and therefore the mobility that we all so take for granted, going and getting our cars MOT'd, and people being able to buy a vehicle that suits their basic budget. The price of electric vehicles, and I'm looking ahead and I'm saying, people are saying the market will determine that. Many of us don't just agree with the market determining most factors, particularly such big social changes that would lead. So I certainly would want to avoid any form of mobility poverty. We talk about fuel poverty regularly, but we certainly do want mobility poverty and access, as that would lead to vital access to services and other means of advancing people's livelihoods. So I'd be interested for your insights on those things, because I'm sure you've encountered those very same questions and maybe different forms as you move through your aspects of the good work that you've done. Please.
Yeah, well, just to say right at the beginning, just because we've done 2 years' work on this doesn't mean we've solved all of the problems. We've been able to identify a lot of the problems, and actually it's the second phase of the Just Transition Commission, where we really need to get to stuck into a lot of these details. But to pull the questions and just address them one by one, it might be quite surprising. We actually spent a lot less time talking about money than you might have expected in the first phase. We were actually more concerned with the kind of the processes, which you needed to add to the money, which was obviously seen as a prerequisite. And it's just to flag that Scotland does now have a national investment bank that has been created, which is owned by the Scottish government, but works in a sort of wholly owned by the Scottish government, that works in a kind of private sector mode. And that is actually quite important, because it's got just transition as a concept built into its articles of association. So it will be thinking about that. And the Scottish government is up to putting money into it, because there's been a fairly massive fund to deal with economic transformation in the northeast of Scotland, which will also obviously be affected by the movement out of oil and gas. But specifically on the question of kind of education, first of all, we identified under our skills theme, we made specific recommendations about skills and training for people working in the agricultural sector, because we recognised it very much as an issue. And just to say, one of the things we did go out and about, so the whole commission spent time tramping around the cowsheds and going into evening meetings with farmers to talk about the kind of issues that you face. And we were probably at these meetings talking about with the farmers who were most ready for change. So they understood that, that there are issues, that there are opportunities, there are things you can do with better management of soils on farms, for example, that make a positive contribution. They help adapt to climate change physically, but they also contribute to mitigation, as the soils can absorb more carbon. And I think one of the things we're credit with is farmers should get credit for the positive things that they can do, and not just the threatening things like moving land over to woodlands or the fact that people might want to eat less beef. All these kind of issues. We heard all of the kind of challenges, and Kate helped us work through there. But for many people, we're talking about many of the other farmers who were less moved on, and the constant theme we got was, why do you do that? Well, it's I been done like that, and it's I been done like that issue is one that we need to recognise that younger people coming along under the system may be readier for change when they're managing the land than perhaps people who've been there for a long time. And this touches on horrible issues like multi-generation leases for tenancies, and why you can't pass them on until you're 65 years old. And so there's all sorts of, kind of issues that we got tangled with. So basically, we saw education and upskilling in the agricultural sector, and the pursuit of more scientific approaches, perhaps, as being actually quite key. On the transport issue, we absolutely took this one on. We were asked by the Scottish Government to produce a report on the green recovery about 18 months ago, recognising that COVID was also having big implications, and you could tie that together with some of the just transition aspects. And we picked up transport and public transport as one of the big problems, partly because of the loss of faith, perhaps, in public transport because of the COVID situation. So we made a sort of big recommendations about public transport, including trialling free public transport in some areas, to see how it would work in terms of continuing to get support for that, which would especially support rural areas. On electric vehicles, we have absolutely picked this out under the who pays issue, because they are more expensive, and some of the government support, for the first purchase is actually going down. And charging infrastructure is absolutely critical. And I have to say, the Scottish Government has actually been putting quite a lot of effort in making sure the charging infrastructure is there, so that it just doesn't help people in urban areas, but it helps with interurban trips and help people moving around. So that is absolutely critical. And maybe perhaps the final to say, I think there's a big connection with the digital connectivity as well with rural areas, to make sure that there's adequate broadband access. So if people are getting into new kind of businesses, they can work very well from rural areas, to add it on to the pure physical transport connectivity as well. And just to say, the Scottish Ministerial portfolio does have a separate portfolio on digital connectivity as well, that ties into this question of what happens to rural areas. So we haven't got all the answers, but we sure enough have identified that there's a mountain of problems that need to be addressed there, that I think will be shared between Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just one point is that, back to the electric vehicles, have you given thought to that key issue, which is obviously part of transition, is to that issue of transition to the use of electric vehicles, the cost of those vehicles, especially for people on lower incomes?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, it's a problem, we absolutely recognised. I mean, we don't have the answers on it. And when we go into our monitoring and evaluation framework, I think looking at the indicators, where are the costs falling on individual groups of people, and how is that affected by their ability to pay? It will absolutely be within the sites. But I'm not saying we've got the answers on that. Just because we worked for it in 2 years, we haven't got all the answers. We just identified all the difficult questions. Really.
As one of the answers, maybe the only one that's floating around in my head, is that some sort of subsidy be provided that allows for acquisition of those vehicles. Subsidy which is related to, obviously, the person's an incentivized subsidy that's related to the person's means themselves. Now, whether that involves means testing for vehicles, it takes us into a different direction. But it's the only thing that I can think myself, and obviously you're the experts in these things. Have you given any thought to that, or has anyone?
And just to say, I mean, obviously there are subsidies for first purchase of electric vehicles, but these subsidies are going down at the moment. And
yes.
In Scotland, as in Northern Ireland, there's this perpetual issue of the relationship between the devolved administration and the reserve powers at Westminster. Yes. And taxation is still a reserve power for Westminster. So a lot of our recommendations come in the form of the Scottish Government should press the UK Government to do X and Y because of powers that do not lie within the Scottish competence.
Yes. Okay, Professor Skey, thanks very much indeed for your time again.
Well, okay, thank you.
Okay. Claire.
Thanks, Chair. And thanks, Professor Skey, for being with us. It's great to listen to you, and good luck in your in your years ahead. It's a huge job, but I mean, you rightly point out that just transition, exactly like climate action itself, doesn't fit neatly into a siloed remit. It absolutely touches on all areas, every sector, all government departments, and that's really what's highlighting how we need to shift from how we have modelled how we do business now, and how that system, I suppose, doesn't maybe fit very often with bringing us to where we need to be. And just on that one, I just picked up on what you're saying about working with the farmers and the agri sector, and the first ones that you go and speak to was those who were ready for change, who were needing the change and maybe got the ideas. But I'm wondering, just in that context of how much we need to do business differently and where we start and where we struggle from, have you found to date much resistance in trying to get that onto the agenda, or where are those points, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, it's astounding really how much climate change, has influenced Scottish policy. We've got a First Minister that is really up for it, and it just kind of spreads through the whole political the whole political system. And there's an extraordinary amount of buy-in in Scotland. I mean, one thing I'd find, as well as our process, we had the Citizens' Assembly that was running at the same time, where it was just ordinary people who were picked in to run with this process. And, I dropped into it. I was an observer for some parts of it, and I helped act as a kind of an expert whose brains they picked in different groups. But they did that very aggressively and very selectively, I have to say. They did a really good job on it. And these people were so enthusiastic about it. They were supposed to commit, I think, 4 weekends, and they asked for a 5th one to be added. And the Scottish Government has just, I noticed in something that popped into my email box just before I came into this meeting, Scottish Government has now responded to the Citizens' Assembly recommendations, and the Citizens' Assembly will be coming back for a 6th weekend in February to respond to the responses, if I can put it that way. And the amount of enthusiasm that was generated around that process was quite extraordinary. There was the scattering kind of sceptics who wouldn't deal with it in the process, but actually it was really widespread, and the buy-in and the acknowledgement that something has to change, and acknowledging that the world is moving on a bit at the moment.
I think that's really, really heartening to hear. And I know that England also carried out a Citizens' Assembly model on this issue, and I know that the Irish Constitution has Citizens' Assemblies written into it as well. So I think, here we are again, Northern Ireland lagging behind. We've never had that Citizens' Assembly, but it's absolutely critical. I think when you give people the facts, when you allow them the safe space to explore the issues, that's the very place where you begin to bring people with you, because this is not stuff that I think that we should be allowing people to feel it's being done to them in terms of the change and the shift, but has to be done with them. Maybe I want to ask you, your Just Transition Commission, is it an independent body from government? Or
yeah.
Is it, yeah.
Yeah, it is. It doesn't have a statutory basis, which means you don't go through all the Nolan kind of processes to make the appointments. The Ministerial, it is appointed by ministers, but in both cases this involved a huge amount of consultation across the government system to make sure that stakeholders different stakeholder groups were being represented properly. And in both cases, because my appointment came before the other commission members, I was also consulted quite heavily about the process as well, to make sure I was comfortable with the balance of people that came onto it. I might add that, one of the issues is, why did they appoint me to be the chair of it? Because I sit in London, not in Edinburgh or Glasgow. I'm doing this from Earl's Court in London. And, on the one hand, that means my finger isn't quite as much on the pulse of which stakeholders should be engaged as much as somebody who was actually there. On the other hand, I stood apart a little bit from what I might call the different tribes that you might get in there. So I was perceived as kind of a fair, kind of arbiter, that I wasn't dug in with one group or another. And I think that was probably one of the things that was in the mind of the Scottish ministers when they came to me, as opposed to coming to somebody else.
Great, and I could just get another one in, if that's all right. And I note that you've also produced a report with a whole series of recommendations too that have been accepted by the Scottish Government, and they'll be working closely with you to try and deliver those as well. But can I ask you then, in terms of the UKCCC, what remit do you have as a commission that sits apart from the CCC, and how do you both work together?
Yeah, just to say, I was on the CCC for 11 years, so I have lots of contacts with them. And Chris Stark, the chief executive, actually still lives in Glasgow and commutes down. So we're quite, there's a lot of kind of informal communication as well. But the CCC's role is to produce recommendations on the Scottish targets in numerical terms, how quickly they should be going, and broadly to measure progress, in what you call a more technical kind of way as to whether the targets are being met. So theirs is much more focused on the kind of the ambition, whereas the Just Transition Commission's remit, we were not asked to make any comment whatsoever on the levels of Scotland's ambition, how you get there. It was all about the process and how you get there, and specifically the social and economic consequences. Now, just to say, the Scottish Climate Change Act, within which the UK Committee on Climate Change works, does mention just transition as one of the principles that will be followed. So I think there will be a little bit of grey area, where we have to talk with each other. So the terms of reference for the second phase of the Just Transition Commission lists a long list of bodies with whom we should be consulting. And the UK Committee on Climate Change is one of these bodies. I have to say, for a very small country, Scotland generates a large number of advisory bodies and acronyms to go with it. And there are along, the Fair Work Convention, the Justice Commission, etc. There's a long list of bodies we need to consult with. And I think there is an issue about, over advice. You've got so many bodies providing advice in similar areas that we do need to keep quite a careful eye on that.
Thanks very much for that. Maybe want to just pay attention.
Okay, thank you, Claire. And we'll move on now to William. William, you're on mute. Yeah, we hear you now, William.
Thank you very much. Agri-food and agriculture and rural wildlife plays a big role in Northern Ireland and in our economy. Do you believe Just Transition would give some protection to that way of life and to that sector?
So sorry, I can't have that. But just to say, traditionally, Just Transition was really only applied to sort of energy kind of issues. And I think one of the advances that the Scottish Commission made was to say it's got to apply to other things as well. And I was very, we had agriculture, we had Kate Roll, from Climate Meat, Quality Meat Scotland, on the first commission. So farmers were well represented. And I was pretty insistent when we were establishing commissioners for the second phase that agriculture and land use should also be also be covered in there, because actually it's more than the Scottish economy is made up a bit differently from the Northern Ireland one. Certainly, our emissions inventory is quite different, but the way that land is used is really an important part of Scottish cultural identity, and we need to make sure that that is properly covered in there. So I wouldn't regard it as, just transition as a high-level concept that has implications for farmers. You need to actually start at the other end and make sure that the farming community is engaged. It's really important that this isn't a top-down process that starts in Edinburgh and works its way through Scotland. It's got to be done in a very bottom-up kind of way, where you take account of the needs of different groups of people. And that is the way that really we're constructing that Just Transition Commission, and our remit to get really involved in stakeholder engagement right from the beginning, so that we understand what the needs of different communities are and how they could potentially be affected, and how you could mitigate any of the kind of risks that go with the changes that are needed.
Yeah, well, for Northern Ireland, agriculture and agri-food and the rural way of life is vital to particularly our economy in Northern Ireland. So I think it's very important that that's bottom up would be very good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, William. Okay, Professor Skey, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Oh, sorry, I see Rosemary. I was looking to ask a question. Sorry, Rosemary. Rosemary?
Thank you. I was just very interested in what Professor Skea said, that last comment. Professor Skea, you spoke about the bottom-up plan in looking at for just transition. Is it possible, by going from the bottom up, do you think that you brought along your agricultural, your economic people, agroeconomic people with you, etc., etc.? Was it easier work that way?
Right. Let's just say I still think agriculture and land is unfinished business for Just Transition in Scotland, for various reasons, because the nature of the Scottish economy, the issue that is dominated is between oil and gas, and how you get out of the North Sea in a kind of dignified way and redeploy all the skills and competences in the oil and gas industry. And the conversation is actually much further forward in terms of that sector of the economy than it is in agriculture and land use. And I think some of the challenges we have in agriculture and land use are really very embedded in the land tenure kind of system that we have in Scotland, and the dominance of tenant farming, and what that may do to tenant farmers, because we're getting examples of people having their tenancy ended and the ultimate landowner switching the land use over to woodland, and this is not a just transition. We know that, and I think these are some of the issues that we're going to need to really roll up our sleeves on and get stuck into in the second phase. We have not got all the answers on that, and I'm just humbled by I'm an energy person, and I am humbled by the complexity of all the issues around agriculture and land use, and how embedded it is in land ownership patterns and the way that the social structures are organised. So I'm not going to confess we do not have all the answers on that. We really need to think about it much harder.
Okay, so it's unfinished business and something you're going to have to look at over the next few years then?
Absolutely. And I was actually asking some of the people the support for the Committee on Land Use Ownership Patterns in Northern Ireland. I don't think it's at all the same in Northern Ireland as in Scotland, so the same answers may not apply at all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm glad I got you there, Rosemary, at the end. I just seen you come in there in the WhatsApp group. So thank you, Professor Skea, for attending and briefing us here this morning, and for giving us the benefit of your knowledge and experience in this field. So thank you, and happy Christmas.
Okay, Merry Christmas to you all, and thanks for listening. Very instructive, just listening to the questions, actually.
Thank you. Right, take care, Professor Skea, now, okay?
Bye.
Bye. Okay, members, I'll go jump right back on here now to we had considered up until item 15 for our work programme, and now we're going to go to item number 16. It's any other business. Remember, any other business you want to raise with us? Okay. One of the things that maybe just when we were chatting about the climate issue earlier, a note we all would have been circulated with the KPMG report, which has raised many issues, and I'm wondering, would it be possible to maybe ask our research department just to give a little an analysis of that there, just to sort of aid our exploration and understanding of the issues a bit further. Would that be okay?
That would be very good, isn't it? Yeah.
Good. Okay, members, so item number 17 is the date and time of the next meeting. That will take place on the Thursday, the 6th of January at 10 a.m. and will be a hybrid meeting streamed on the Assembly's website. We're going to move till closed session now in a moment, so we just want to wish anyone who's listening in a very happy Christmas and hope you have a very peaceful and safe and prosperous 2022. We'll hopefully see us online in January, but we'll ask members to stay on now till we continue our informal deliberations on the Climate Change number 2 bill.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30.